I have spent enough time studying the architecture of power to understand something most political analysts overlook entirely. Power does not reside in declarations, treaties, or diplomatic agreements. Power resides in infrastructure. The nation that controls the physical systems through which economic activity flows controls the economic activity itself. This was true in Roman times when control of roads and aqueducts defined imperial reach. It was true in the 19th century when control of railways and shipping lanes determined which nations prospered and which remained peripheral. And it was true in post-war North America when American control over the infrastructure through which Canadian trade flowed gave Washington effective veto power over Canadian policy for 80 consecutive years. What Canada built between 2025 and the present did not challenge American military capability or contest American economic size. What Canada built was physical infrastructure that made American control over Canadian economic activity structurally impossible. Not difficult, not expensive to maintain, impossible. An infrastructure, once built, persists regardless of political leadership, diplomatic tensions, or strategic calculations. You cannot diplomatically negotiate away a functioning port. You cannot sanction a railway into non-existence. You cannot pressure a processing facility into closure. Physical infrastructure created through capital investment exists independently of political will. It functions according to economic logic rather than political permission. To understand why this matters, you must first understand how completely American control over Canadian policy had depended on infrastructure gaps rather than military superiority or cultural influence. The United States never needed to threaten Canada militarily. It never needed to impose political conditions explicitly. It simply needed to ensure that the physical systems through which Canadian goods reached markets, through which Canadian resources were processed, and through which Canadian trade was settled, all ran through American-controlled territory and American-controlled systems. For 80 years after Bretton Woods established American dominance over the international economic order, this infrastructure configuration was maintained deliberately. Rail systems running north to south channeled Canadian trade through American territory. Port facilities were optimized for destinations accessible only through American-controlled waters. Financial clearing systems required American intermediation for international settlement. Processing and manufacturing capacity resided overwhelmingly in American territory, meaning Canadian resources had to cross the border before generating significant economic value. This was not accidental geography. This was designed infrastructure dependence. Every time a Canadian government had considered building alternative infrastructure, the cost appeared prohibitive relative to the economic benefit of maintaining existing systems. Why build a new Pacific port when Vancouver already serves Pacific trade adequately? Why develop Arctic shipping when traditional routes through the St. Lawrence function effectively? Why invest in domestic processing when American manufacturers offer competitive terms? Each individual question seemed reasonable. Collectively, the answers guaranteed Canadian dependence on American infrastructure for another generation. Mark Carney recognized something that previous Canadian leadership had failed to grasp. The question was never whether individual infrastructure investments justified their cost in isolation. The question was whether comprehensive infrastructure investment could transform Canada's strategic position permanently. Whether the combination of ports, railways, processing facilities, and shipping routes could create a network through which Canadian economic activity could flow without ever touching American territory or American systems. The answer, which required $1.2 trillion in systematic construction across multiple domains simultaneously, was yes. And the infrastructure that was built between 2025 and 2026 represents the most significant physical transformation of North American economic geography since the construction of the transcontinental railways in the 19th century. The first and perhaps most symbolically significant component was the transformation of Churchill Port in Manitoba from seasonal outpost to year-round deep-water facility capable of handling the largest commercial vessels on the planet. Churchill had been dismissed as economically irrelevant for decades. A remote northern location accessible only during brief summer months when Arctic ice retreated sufficiently to permit navigation. Port facilities consisted of basic grain handling equipment and storage capacity designed for modest seasonal traffic. But Churchill possessed one geographic characteristic that no amount of political opposition could alter. It was the only deep-water Arctic port in North America with direct rail connection to continental population centers. The Hudson Bay Railway, running nearly 1,000 kilometers from Winnipeg to the Arctic coast, connected Churchill to the Canadian rail network and through it to all major Canadian population centers and production regions. Climate change was progressively opening Arctic shipping routes that had been blocked by ice for centuries. This was not speculative. This was documented by satellite imagery, shipping data, and navigational surveys that showed navigable passages expanding year after year. And as those passages opened, Churchill's geographic position transformed from irrelevant to strategically critical. A cargo ship traveling from Hamburg to Winnipeg saves 6,400 kilometers using Churchill rather than traditional routes through the St. Lawrence Seaway or American ports. 12 days of reduced transit time, $620,000 in fuel cost savings per voyage, $180 billion funded transformation of Churchill into infrastructure capable of exploiting this geographic advantage permanently. Icebreaker capacity was expanded to ensure 12-month navigation regardless of ice conditions. The Hudson Bay Railway was completely rebuilt with permafrost protection systems, automated switching, and loading capacity to handle dramatically increased traffic. Port facilities were constructed to rival major commercial ports anywhere on the continent. Grain terminals capable of loading 100,000-ton vessels were installed. Container handling systems were built to process volumes previously impossible at Arctic latitudes. By September 2025, the first post-Panamax container ship docked at Churchill loaded with Canadian wheat bound for Germany. This was not ceremonial. This was operational proof that the infrastructure functioned as designed. European buyers could source Canadian agricultural products without transit through American territory, without passage through American-controlled waters, without using American ports or American financial clearing systems. The entire trade relationship occurred through Canadian infrastructure on Canadian territory using Canadian transportation systems. The significance extended far beyond agricultural exports. Any Canadian product that could move by container or bulk carrier could now reach European and Asian markets through Canadian-controlled shipping routes immune to American interdiction. Churchill was not merely a port. Churchill was proof that Canadian trade could flow entirely outside American infrastructure systems. And proof, once demonstrated, cannot be undiscovered. But Churchill alone, despite its strategic significance, addressed only one dimension of Canadian infrastructure dependence. The second major component of the infrastructure strategy addressed the east-west trade corridor problem that had kept Canadian economic activity oriented toward American markets for generations. $340 billion funded systematic construction of transportation infrastructure connecting Canadian Pacific, Atlantic, and Arctic ports into an integrated network capable of moving goods coast to coast without routing through American territory. Rail upgrades eliminated bottlenecks that had made transcontinental Canadian shipping uneconomical relative to north-south routes through American systems. Port capacity expansions in Vancouver and Prince Rupert created Pacific trade infrastructure capable of handling dramatically increased Asian trade volumes. Atlantic port development in Halifax established European trade capacity independent of St. Lawrence access. Most critically, regulatory and customs frameworks were harmonized simultaneously with European and Asian standards rather than exclusively American standards. Infrastructure capable of moving goods physically is insufficient if regulatory systems require American compliance at every stage. By building compatibility with European and Asian regulatory frameworks, Canadian exporters could access those markets with the same operational ease they had previously accessed American markets. The friction that had made alternative markets appear less attractive than American markets disappeared when infrastructure and regulatory systems were built to serve those alternatives directly. The third infrastructure component addressed a dependency that was less visible but equally fundamental: critical minerals processing and advanced manufacturing capacity. For 80 years, Canada had exported raw materials and imported finished products. This pattern was not the result of Canadian inability to process resources domestically. It was the result of infrastructure gaps that made domestic processing uneconomical relative to exporting raw materials to American processors. $280 billion funded construction of processing facilities across the full value chain from extraction through finished products. Lithium processing plants transformed raw lithium into battery-grade materials domestically. Rare earth element refineries processed extracted minerals into the intermediate products required by advanced technology manufacturing. Uranium enrichment facilities enabled Canadian nuclear fuel to serve international customers without American intermediation. Nickel processing capacity allowed Canadian nickel to enter global supply chains as refined material rather than raw ore. Each of these facilities represented physical infrastructure that existed independently of political conditions. A lithium processing plant in Ontario functions whether American trade policy is accommodating or hostile. A rare earth refinery in Quebec produces output regardless of diplomatic tensions between Ottawa and Washington. Processing infrastructure, once operational, generates returns based on market demand rather than political permission. American influence over Canadian resource policy depended on Canadian resources flowing south for processing. When processing infrastructure exists domestically, that flow stops, and physical infrastructure cannot be diplomatically pressured into non-existence. The cumulative effect of these three integrated infrastructure components was the construction of a complete alternative economic network through which Canadian economic activity could flow without touching American systems at any point. Raw materials extracted domestically were processed domestically into finished products. Finished products moved through Canadian transportation networks to Canadian ports. Canadian ports shipped those products to European and Asian markets through Arctic routes over Canadian waters. Payment was settled through financial systems that did not require American clearing mechanisms. This was not a theoretical capability. This was operational infrastructure, generating revenue and processing trade volumes that increased monthly as capacity reached full utilization. Canadian wheat was flowing to Germany through Churchill. Canadian lithium was reaching Asian battery manufacturers through Pacific ports. Canadian rare earth elements were serving European technology companies through Atlantic facilities. Every trade flow that had previously required American infrastructure now operated entirely through Canadian systems. The market understood immediately what these infrastructure developments meant for the balance of power in North American trade. Canadian wheat futures jumped 23% when European buyers recognized they could source without American intermediation. Potash prices spiked 31% as fertilizer companies secured Canadian supply agreements that bypassed American territory entirely. Foreign direct investment in Canadian logistics infrastructure jumped 340%, as global capital recognized that Canada had constructed operational independence. But the most significant market signal came from American corporate testimony before Congress in December 2025. Over 3 days, 147 American business leaders testified about the consequences of Canadian infrastructure development for American economic relationships. Ford cited $1.4 billion in losses from supply chain disruptions as Canadian suppliers redirected production to non-American customers. GM closed 2 Michigan plants because Canadian component costs made continued manufacturing uneconomical. The American Trucking Association called the overall situation economically suicidal. These testimonies were not complaints about Canadian aggression or hostile policy. They were reports from American businesses that had operated for decades within an infrastructure configuration that guaranteed Canadian economic dependence on American systems. That configuration no longer existed. Canadian suppliers now had alternative customers accessible through Canadian infrastructure. American buyers who had treated Canadian resources as captive dependencies discovered those resources were no longer captive because the infrastructure that had made them captive had been replaced. I want to emphasize what makes infrastructure-based transformation fundamentally different from policy-based or diplomatic transformation. Policies can be reversed when political leadership changes. Diplomatic agreements can be renegotiated when strategic calculations shift. But infrastructure persists. A functioning port continues to function regardless of who governs in Ottawa or Washington. A railway continues to carry goods regardless of diplomatic tensions between the nations at either end. Processing facilities continue to produce output regardless of trade policy shifts. Churchill Port will not revert to seasonal irrelevance because an American administration offers favorable trade terms. East-west trade corridors will not be abandoned because Washington reduces tariffs. Processing facilities will not close because American manufacturers offer competitive pricing. The infrastructure exists. It generates returns. It serves customers who have built their own operations around its capabilities. Dismantling infrastructure that functions profitably is not a strategic choice any government can justify to its citizens. This permanence is precisely what made infrastructure the correct vehicle for Canadian strategic transformation. If Carney had attempted to achieve independence through policy changes alone, those policies could have been reversed by future Canadian governments facing American pressure. If he had relied on diplomatic agreements, those agreements could have been renegotiated when political circumstances changed. But by investing $1.2 trillion in physical infrastructure that made American control structurally impossible, he created a transformation that persists regardless of future political decisions in either country. The relationship between Canada and the United States continues because both nations benefit from trade and economic cooperation. But that relationship now occurs through infrastructure that gives Canada genuine alternatives at every stage. Canadian exporters can choose American markets or European and Asian markets with equal operational ease. Canadian resource producers can sell raw materials domestically or export processed products through Canadian ports. Canadian trade can settle through American financial systems or alternative mechanisms with comparable efficiency. When alternatives exist at every stage, the relationship becomes voluntary rather than coercive. Voluntary relationships operate on fundamentally different dynamics than coerced ones. In coerced relationships, the stronger party dictates terms because the weaker party has no choice. In voluntary relationships, both parties must offer terms that the other party finds acceptable or risk losing the relationship entirely. American power had maintained Canadian subordination for 80 years by ensuring Canada had no choice. Infrastructure investment eliminated that condition permanently. I have watched enough structural transformations to recognize when the physical world catches up with political ambitions. For decades, Canadian strategists had articulated the need for infrastructure independence, but articulation without construction changes nothing. Infrastructure independence required construction. Construction required capital. Capital required political will sufficient to justify $1.2 trillion in investment. Trump's tariffs provided that political will by making continued dependence feel more dangerous than the cost of independence. The tariffs were the political catalyst, but the transformation was physical. Infrastructure was built. Ports were constructed. Railways were upgraded. Processing facilities were opened. Ships began docking. Goods began flowing through systems that did not require American permission. And once goods flow through infrastructure, they continue flowing as long as the infrastructure exists and demand persists. Neither condition is likely to change within any foreseeable time frame. What Canada built was not merely infrastructure in the conventional sense. What Canada built was the physical architecture of sovereignty. The ports, railways, processing facilities, and shipping routes that allow a nation to participate in global economic activity without requiring permission from any other nation. This architecture, once constructed, defines the strategic reality of North American power for generations. American control over Canadian policy depended on infrastructure gaps. Those gaps no longer exist. And infrastructure gaps, unlike diplomatic disagreements or policy disputes, cannot be restored through negotiation or political pressure. The physical world has spoken. The infrastructure exists. The trade flows through it. The alternatives are operational. An operational infrastructure that generates revenue and serves growing customer demand will continue to function regardless of what happens in Washington or Ottawa or any other capital city. This is how power permanently changes hands, not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient construction of physical systems that make previous power configurations structurally impossible to maintain. History does not record the infrastructure that made control impossible. History records only that control ended. But I have seen enough transitions to know the truth. Behind every shift in the balance of power, there is infrastructure that was built to make the old balance unsustainable. Canada built that infrastructure, and what was built cannot be unbuilt.